We'll talk about the half-day talent planning sessions that Kevin Watson mentioned that the MEDC is essentially funding. And those are great tools to create a strategy for your own organization. Then we'll talk about knowledge capture and transfer, and we'll talk next steps. So with that, I'm going to spend just a very short period of time. I flipped it. Did it go through? So we've got a company that's been around for 40 years at EDSI. We're headquartered down in Dearborn. And just one thing I'd like to mention about us, we determined a number of years ago that the talent war was really building and becoming critical. And for us, we have 650 employees. What we found is it became increasingly difficult to attract and retain the kind of talent that we needed. And so we determined that really the companies that win in the long term were going to be companies that had built a great culture, that built what we called a destination employer type culture. So we went down the road of trying to build a great culture, and it's a journey. We've spent a number of years on this, and we're not there yet. But last year, we were the only company in Michigan to win all the Best Places to Work awards, which we were very proud of. And yet we still feel like we have a long way to go to become an even better company. But what's more important about that from our perspective is we now have more applicants coming to us than we have jobs. So the pipeline of talent that wants to work at EDSI exceeds what our need for new talent is. And that's a great place to be, because what we're finding is most of our clients have just the opposite situation. So here's just a sample of some of the organizations that we've worked with. We've worked with very small companies with $1 or $2 million in revenue, all the way up to very large organizations like Starbucks and Little Caesars Pizza, Harley-Davidson motorcycles. The talent-related issues that exist are not limited to small, large, or one type of company or industry. It's across the board in the United States. So let's talk about the talent war and the perfect storm, because it's here. And the scary thing is my assumption is that many of you on the phone are HR professionals. The reality is this: it's been very painful to most of our clients, especially in the HR space. And when you look at the details, it's really just going to get worse. So we have to plan for it. We can't just do what we've been doing in the past. So the first thing to mention is the fact that we've lost the fact that it's not an employer's market anymore. It's really become an employee's market. And I was in a discussion the other day, and there was an individual that was talking about this very issue. And he made the comment that for the first time since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we have more jobs than we have qualified workers. So, and when you really begin to dig into the detail and understand the data, that's really the case. And if you look at this particular chart, those blue bars are jobs created. The red line is the unemployment rate. And that's actually now a little bit outdated. We've been creating jobs steadily since 2010. And what we've seen is the unemployment rate has been going down and down and down, and we're now at 3.9, so we're below 4%, which, depending on which economist you listen to, full employment is somewhere between 4 and 4.5%. So we're beyond that point, and it's certainly the lowest level now that we've had in over 20 years. To complicate matters, our workforce is changing. 3 years ago, we saw a switch where we went from Gen Xers being the dominant factor in the workforce to the millennials being the largest factor in the workforce. So for many of us, I am a baby boomer, and I am 55 years old. I'm the managing partner of EDSI Consulting, and I grew up in an environment where I felt like we were lucky to essentially have a job, and you put up with some of the negatives that you found in any organization. So with that, we found that many of us that are now baby boomers or older Gen Xers are running organizations, and we have to recognize that we have various generations in the workforce, and they have different needs and behaviors. If you look out to just a couple more years, in 2020, in some organizations, we'll actually have 5 generations in their workforce. We'll see that we'll have the new Gen Z coming into the workforce, and in some cases, there will still be some organizations that have some traditionalists in those organizations. And I'll tell you, it makes for incredible complexity in managing an organization and creating the kind of culture that's going to be attractive, especially to the dominant elements of the workforce that we want going forward. And if you really think about it, I tell the story that when I was a kid, I remember going to my grandma's house. She lived in Royal Oak. And on her wall, she had one of those old phones, and it was a big wooden box that was about 2 foot tall by about 1 foot wide, and it was about 10 inches deep. And off the side of it, it had an earpiece that you pulled out and you put next to your ear. It had a microphone that you had to lift up and speak into, and to get the phone started, you had to crank it on the outside. And I think about it, and I think that's kind of ridiculous and kind of funny. And yet, when I talk to my kids about, we used to have these phones with cords, and you could only go as far as the cord was, and we typically would have maybe 1 or 2 phones in every household. And anytime you had to make or take a phone call, you had to go to that phone, and you had to stand in that area or sit in that area and talk on that phone, and only one person could talk at a time. So now you think about phones today. You can FaceTime, you can Skype, you can do all these things where you can see the person you're talking to. You have handheld computers embedded in it. You have your music with you. The technology just in the phone alone has gone from a 1 to a 100 in terms of complexity. And then you think about just all the other things, the differences in generations that exist. Some Gen Zs remember only having radio in their house, or not having a radio, and no television, all the way to baby boomers, where we were the ones that watched colored TV come in. We were the ones that watched microwaves come into the kitchen, etc. And now you look at the millennials and the Gen Zs. They were born and raised with computers in their house. So the differences among the generations has become dramatic, and we have to create environments that are accommodating and productive to all of those generations. So right now, the biggest entrant generation into the workforce, and now the biggest part of the workforce, are millennials. And for many of us, we wrestle with how do we create an environment that's productive with millennials. The common things that we hear from our clients is this. They want to be CEO after a year. They need a lot of communication. They're never happy. They seem to leave. We can't retain them. After 6 months, they're unhappy. They want to do something different, and they leave. Well, the reality is this. Gallup did a very large study a few years back looking at different generations and what is most important or extremely important to them when they're applying for a job. And you can see that those 2 orange dots that we've put the star and arrows pointing towards them are 2 things. Millennials really want to have an opportunity to learn and grow, so they want to gain skills. They recognize that technology is changing, the environment is constantly changing, and they've grown up in an environment where they know they have to continuously learn to really stay current. The other thing is they want to see opportunities for advancement. It's critical that they see those opportunities for advancement. There was an expert that we talked to recently about generational differences. And this lady commented that, part of what drives that is it's embedded in the millennial mindset, and that is that many of them grew up playing games. And even in school, they had games that would lead to different levels. And once you achieved a different level, you could move on to the next thing or the next level of the game. So those opportunities for advancements were built into how they thought, how they played games, how they really went about their daily lives. So we have to create those opportunities for advancement in organizations. And just one simple thing, we're working with a company in the I-69 Thumb region, and the individual said, well, look, I have this entry-level job, and many of the people, many of the workers in our company are in that job maybe for many years. So there really aren't opportunities for them to advance. These particular individuals install networks into houses, they install networks into commercial and industrial buildings, et cetera. And so when we really looked at it, we said, well, wait a minute, you actually can have different levels of installers. You can have a level 1, you can have a level 2 and a level 3. A level 1 is entry level. Level 2 is after they've gained certain levels of skills. Level 3 is when they're at the point where they can do all of the critical tasks that are involved. And then you could create, the team leader, somebody that will manage the installer team. So you can actually create 4 different jobs out of what you have as just one today. And oh, by the way, every 6 months when somebody reaches that new level, they're going to feel good about the fact that they've achieved a new level and that they're ready to pursue the next level. So that's critical to understand on a lot of levels for organizations. What's very interesting is the baby boomers actually have more blue dots, as you can see, farther out to the right than any of the other generations. So if you really interpret that, you could argue that the baby boomers are the neediest of the generations. And it's interesting because I think many of us have had enough work experience where we're very picky about what we want and what we know about work environments. But what's also interesting to know is that we're seeing a shift with Gen Xers and we're seeing a shift with baby boomers. And that is that they're starting to desire a number of the other things that, say, the millennials want. For example, flexibility. We're seeing that all generations are creating or craving more flexibility in their work environment. So it's a very complex situation, and it makes it difficult for corporate leaders. It makes it difficult for you as HR professionals to create an environment where you're not just constantly churning and burning through your employee base. The critical thing now is that, as we've talked about, employee needs and wants have shifted, and culture is trumping everything else. Culture has become the critical element that drives a good talent strategy. You have to have a culture that's desirable and that's accommodating and that is attractive to folks not only in your organization, but folks that are outside of your organization. So let's talk about some specific statistics as it pertains to what's going on in the talent war out there. But before I move on, are there any specific questions, Kevin, that anybody has typed in? If you have any questions about what I've said thus far, please make sure that you type them in, and we will address them as they come in. So first of all, I want to talk about the open jobs in America. Right now we have 5.95 million open positions in America. This is the largest number of open jobs that we've ever seen statistically. And every quarter, when the new stats come out, we see that we set a new record. And to most of us, myself included, when I saw that number, I didn't really know how to put it into perspective. And the reality is, 6 million jobs is a lot of jobs. If you look at just the logos that we've got on the screen, Walmart, General Motors, General Electric, McDonald's, Home Depot, all of those companies, if you took every position that they have across America, they don't add up to 6 million jobs, which is pretty incredible. So imagine every one of those companies that you're looking at there not having a single employee and that every position of theirs was open and then some. So that gives you some perspective. The thing that is confusing to a lot of folks is that when you look at the statistics, there's also 6.5 million people looking for jobs. The reality is this. First of all, when you dig into this data, many of them aren't truly looking for full-time positions, but there's a massive skills gap. And when you think about it, I look at, for example, kids coming out of college. Many of these folks are actually college grads that have degrees in fields that don't have high demand for talent. So I'll give you an example. I was sitting out around a bonfire with one of my sons and a bunch of his friends. And we started talking about the kinds of jobs. Many of them were recent college graduates. We're talking about the kinds of jobs that they were looking for. And just, sprinkling the infield with questions, I started asking, what did you get your degree in? And when I started talking to these kids, two of them actually had degrees in video game programming, okay, which is pretty cool, right? The problem is that the United States is flooded with kids with that degree, and there are very, very few job openings in that space. So, here we've got kids getting degrees in video game programming, videography. Everybody wants to make movies. We had one that had a degree in music production. Everybody wants to be the next Rick Rubin or somebody producing the next great artist. I had one of the young ladies there had a degree in French literature, which is pretty cool. And she was working, her job right now is a part-time job, working as a hostess at a Holiday Inn Express. And when I went around the group, I found all these degrees that I thought, can't be a lot of demand for these degrees. And then I asked, is there anybody here that got a degree in accounting? And nobody spoke up. Is there anybody that got a degree in engineering? And of this fairly large group of kids, one of them got a degree in mechanical engineering. One of them got a degree in management. So really, we're not getting kids through college with degrees that are in demand. And so a lot of these folks that are looking for jobs just simply don't have the skill for those jobs, or they're looking for jobs that don't exist. To make matters more complex and worse from a talent war perspective, we now have over 4 million baby boomers retiring every year. Given the fact that the stock market has improved dramatically over the last couple of years, we're really seeing an acceleration in this number, and the 4 million plus is probably an understated number because we're seeing kind of a significant uptick in this curve. And we're losing all of these folks that have tremendous skills and institutional and competitive knowledge, leaving our workforce, which I'm sure many of you are feeling. So here's kind of the biggest picture issue that we're seeing associated with the war for talent. We've got all of these different dynamics occurring. We have a number of organizations that just simply can't find the people that they need. And we're now beginning to see the new wave of failures occur. And let's talk about this for just a second. If you go back to the 70s and early 80s, we saw a tremendous wave of failures because companies couldn't keep up with quality. Toyota really spearheaded the quality revolution. And when that happened, we saw a lot of manufacturing organizations simply not be able to keep up, and they failed. And then in the 80s and 90s, we saw the cost revolution. We called it the race to the bottom. Who could be the low-cost provider in their service or in their product? And, a great example of that is Walmart, right? Walmart came in, their whole deal is we're going to sell you stuff at the lowest possible price, and we're going to make it so difficult that a lot of these small general retailers are just not going to be able to compete with us. You don't see a whole lot of mom and pop general merchandise stores left in many of the communities that we go into because Walmart or a Meijer has pushed them out. Then we saw the next wave of failures related to technology. Technology drove a massive number of failures and still is driving a number of failures. I always use Netflix and Blockbuster is a great example. When's the last time you saw a Blockbuster? They used to be all over the place, right? You'd go in on a Friday night, you'd pick out your video, you'd take it in, you'd throw it in your VCR. Today, we all have the ability just to do that with Netflix, most of us do, or HBO, etc. And we see that technology has been driving tons of organizations out of business, and there's a new host of winners. So all of those, what I call fail waves, have occurred. But the next failure wave is occurring right now, and we're just at the beginning of that failure wave, and that is related to talent. I was in a meeting with the TMA, which is the Turnaround Management Association, now over a month ago, and I was sitting around a table with a bunch of turnaround professionals, and I said, how many of you are seeing companies become distressed simply because they can't find the talent that they need, or that they've lost talent, or that all of a sudden the price of admission for the employees that they have has gone up dramatically? And literally everybody around the table looked at me and their eyes got big and they said, that's what we're seeing everywhere now. And so we're seeing lack of talent lead to failures in two ways. The first way is that we're seeing companies stop growing because they can't get or keep the talent they need. And that's kind of the first indication that there's an illness going on. The second phase of that illness is companies begin to fail because of talent-related issues. The tricky part is it never presents itself as a talent issue. It normally looks like, oh my gosh, we're having quality issues, or we're having service issues. Suddenly, companies are struggling with quality and service, and when you get to the root cause, it's because of talent. I want to tell you a story about a client of ours that's in mid-Michigan, and they're a plastic injection molding company. This particular company is about a $20 million company. It's 85% automotive, and what they do is they create plastic injected parts, and most of these parts then they assemble into components that go into the inside of automobiles. And what happened is, in the long term, they had all kinds of quality and service issues. They lost their two biggest customers, and they're now a distressed company. They're struggling to stay alive. In our company, our turnaround professionals are working with these folks to try to keep them alive. But when you really look at what was the root cause of their failure, in their assembly department, they had very, very high turnover. And when you look at it, they were paying $9.50 an hour, and they had a terrible culture. And because of this terrible culture, people would come in, they'd work for a very short period of time, and they would leave. And when these folks would leave, they would have to struggle to quickly get more $9.50 an hour folks back into the assembly department. And what really occurred was, because they were so desperate for warm bodies that could pass a drug test and fog a mirror, they were rushing these people in. They weren't adequately training these individuals. And at $9.50 an hour, they weren't always getting maybe the best workers available for their situation. So they were making all kinds of mistakes. And these mistakes led to quality issues, which led to this company losing its two largest customers. That can happen to anybody, especially if you have entry-level jobs that can create major issues for your organization. So I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about the fact that we've got a situation that's in some cases desperate for companies. We've got a situation that's going to get worse for all companies. And oh, by the way, I've had people in the Thumb area and kind of the I-69 corridor say to me, yeah, but we're different. It's a lot worse here because we have a lot of rural communities and we have some unique urban communities. And because of that, our situation's even worse. Well, that's really not the case. What we're seeing is, when we look at national data, this situation in many cases is worse in other parts of Michigan and worse largely in other parts of the country. So you're competing for talent from other parts of Michigan and from other parts of the country. So this war for talent has become a national thing. And if somebody gets a job offer to make 40% more and move to sunny San Diego, you're competing in many cases with those companies. One of the statistics, I think, and Kevin, you have the stats probably top of mind better than I do, but what was the number of people just leaving, for example, Shiawassee County? Do you recall driving to other counties for work?
Yeah, so roughly 70%, 70, actually leave the county of Shiawassee and drive to either Clinton, Eaton, Ingham County, Livingston County, Oakland County, Macomb County. So a lot of times we're talking to local employers and they view their competition from a talent standpoint as companies within their industry or within a 10-mile radius or within the city that they live in. And that's not really who they're competing with. They're competing with folks up to an hour, hour and a half away across a whole bunch of different industries.
We were talking to, thanks, Kev. We were talking to a banker who, CEO of a bank, and he was talking about how he has high turnover levels in a number of his branches, particularly at the teller level. And this particular CEO said to us, well, they're always leaving for more money. And he really was having some significant issues in his branches in terms of customer service. And so we said, well, have you done a compensation analysis? And he said, well, yeah, and we're right in the middle. I compare ourselves to similar banks, and we're right in the middle. And he's a regional bank. And we said, well, where are your tellers typically going? And he goes, well, they're leaving us because they're making $12 an hour, and they're going to this very large bank, Chase, and they're making $14.50 an hour. And so we said, well, are you comparing yourselves to Chase? And he goes, no, because they're a large national bank. I'm comparing myself to regional banks. And that tends to be a common thought process. The reality is his competitors for talent are anybody really probably within commuting distance to his branches. And in that case, Chase Bank, it doesn't matter to somebody that's a teller whether it's a regional bank or a large national bank. They're just looking at the job and they're looking at the pay. And so they're saying, hey, why would I stay here when I can go over here and make $2.50 more an hour, right? That's $5,000 a year to somebody, which is a meaningful difference to a bank teller. So we have to make sure that we're thinking about the war for talent is not just in our region, it's happening everywhere, and you're competing all over the place for talent. All right, let's talk about baby boomers, and let's talk about those older workers or anybody that's highly desirable that may get poached away from you. But mostly, I'm going to focus on the older workers right now. And what do they leave with? Well, when you think about it, they're leaving with customer, vendor, and employee relationships. They often, over maybe a 40-year career, have developed so many relationships that in many cases are irreplaceable. And we have to understand that they're leaving with those relationships. We have to understand and plan for the loss of those relationships. The one thing that I see more than any other in terms of losses and negative impacts for organizations is you get a man or a woman that is 65 years old and maybe they've been in sales and they've spent a lot of time with customers and they have these tremendous relationships and they leave the organization. When that happens, there's more risk and more customer loss than any other event that we see. So identifying those relationships and managing that transition is as critical as anything else out there. What else do the baby boomers leave with, for example? They leave with institutional knowledge. They know what's happened in the past. They know how things were done in the past. They know kind of what has worked, what hasn't worked. Let me give you a really significant example that we saw down in Missouri. We were working with the largest supplier of water, a utility company that provides and manages the water system for many communities around America. And in this particular case, we had an area where they kept having issues with their water system, and it would take days and weeks to fix the issues. So, for example, if there was a leak, and they could find the leak, but they couldn't figure out how to turn off the valves. These companies were essentially, or these communities were struggling because they'd be sometimes for days or weeks on end. And this company realized that, oh my gosh, we've lost all these old technicians that knew how to repair all this stuff and how to find these old valves that maybe are 100 years old and maybe buried or hidden in areas that they had no idea they were even there. And with the loss of all those older maintenance workers, they lost all that knowledge. And all the younger maintenance workers just simply didn't know where to go to turn off these valves. So we can lose tremendous institutional knowledge. Specific skills. I laugh because virtually every manufacturing plant that I walk through, I will see some old equipment. And in this case, this is an old jig bore machine, which you don't see a whole lot anymore. And you can go through plants and you'll always see one or two old machines. And I always love to ask the question, does it still work? Oh yeah, we use it. And how many people know how to run it? And 9 times out of 10, I get the answer, well, it's Bob. And Bob is 70 years old and he's going to work till he dies. And, Bob's the guy every time we need to run this machine that knows how to use it. Well, the problem is if Bob gets hit by a bus or has grandkids and he and his wife decide to move to Florida to follow the grandkids or wherever, right? You've just lost somebody that's the only person that knows how to run that piece of equipment. We see skills leaving organizations all the time, and it costs tons of money when they leave. Process knowledge. This is a large machine shop example. There was a cost estimator, and this particular individual did all of the estimating for a company that was a very, very large machine shop. And here's a place that does over 50 million in revenues per year, and they do a lot of very complex jobs. And they had one person that was able to do all the cost estimating on these jobs. This particular individual was in his late 60s. He was not in great health. And when I talked to the owner of the company about this individual, I said, well, who's his backup? Well, we don't really have one, and we're too busy to really teach somebody how to do that. We don't have enough engineers to really go in and learn from this individual. So here we are in a situation where we've got one individual that does all the heavy-duty cost estimation, and that particular individual's in bad health. If he has a heart attack or gets hit by a bus, this company is going to be in deep, deep trouble because they're not going to be able to do any other significant cost estimating. So process knowledge is commonly lost when boomers leave the organization. Competitive knowledge. How do your competitors react when you do something? How do they typically behave in certain bidding situations? Again, knowledge that's lost when baby boomers leave the organization. So before I do that, if you have any questions, please type them in right now. And then we're going to talk about what specifically you should do. All right. So there's 2 primary things we got to do here. You see Moses there on the screen from that awesome movie, The 10 Commandments, where the acting might be the greatest acting ever. In fact, in my family, it's always one of those things. I love to watch this movie every year. It's like a family tradition, and my wife always just gives me the look like you're a nut every time I watch it, simply because the acting is so overly dramatic. And but I think there was, right there, it was a story, and Moses kind of gave the 10 Commandments. And, today those are a foundation for a lot of governments and a lot of laws that exist in various countries. But at the end of the day, you can create so much complexity that it's not productive. And I like to keep it simple. So let's talk about what do we got to do going forward with what's happening in our workforces from a loss of talent perspective. We have to do succession planning, and we have to do knowledge capture and transfer. Too often organizations do neither of them. And if they do one of them, they tend to do succession planning and they ignore the knowledge capture and transfer piece of it, which is just as important as the succession planning piece, because they really go hand in glove. Let's focus just on succession planning for a minute. You can focus on many individuals, you can focus on one individual or a handful of mission critical individuals. If you haven't really been actively doing succession planning, I like to say just focus first on the ownership piece and on the mission critical individuals. You have to start somewhere, right? So I want you to think for a minute about, let's talk about ownership transition. How many or what percentage of second generation leaders fail? And it's surprising, most of us sense that it's a pretty high number, and it is. It's 60% of all second generation leaders fail. And when we talk about this, you think about it, in startups, there's a very high failure rate for startups. Almost 90% of startups don't make it into their third year. But when a company makes it for 20 or 30 years, and suddenly we have an established business, and the owner transitions that to the second generation of leaders, 60% of them fail. If you think about third generation, our sense is that it's probably a higher number, and it is. 90% of all third generation leaders fail. And oftentimes, by the time you get to third generation, you're often looking at companies that are 40, 50-year-old companies that have been long-standing organizations in their communities, and they fail during that transition of ownership. So I want you in your offices, as you're listening to this, take the next minute and write down the following information. I'm most concerned about implementing succession planning for the following people or positions. All right, thank you. So hopefully you thought about that and you've written some things down. Let's talk about the current situation for succession planning. Let's talk about owners. Oftentimes, the folks that we're talking to in your area have small, mid-sized companies, often privately held. Oftentimes, there's an owner. And here's what we find in the succession of just the ownership. We find that they're thinking about money. How much am I going to get for the company when I transition it to the next generation? They think about time. When am I going to do this? They think about tax. They engage their CPA and they say, hey, help me create a structure that's going to minimize the tax that I'm going to pay during this transition. And they think about the legal documents. Well, what documents do I need to make this real? What they often don't think about are those kids over on the right-hand side in terms of who really is going to be the leader, and am I doing the right things to prepare that person to be successful in the transition? So I want to talk about the mistakes that happen in this process, and they typically wait too long to address these issues, and they've painted themselves into a corner. So the first mistake that people make in this transition with the leadership is they have not identified a clear leader. And when they haven't done that, they've created a multiple head monster. It's critical to pick who is the one leader. Who's going to be that one person that's going to drive this company when you retire? And if you don't do that, you're creating a situation where people are going to have, there's going to be a high level of failure, and there's going to be relationship issues that will exist. So you have to pick one leader. You have to make sure the roles and responsibilities are clear. And you have to ensure that one person has the authority to make those critical decisions. And then if there are non-employee family members that are involved in ownership, They should not be entitled to earnings or decision making. At the end of the day, you want to keep, if they're not employees, keep them completely out of the situation. Here's the problem. Once, if anything goes bad at all in the organization, what we find is the non-employee family members suddenly get really interested and want to get really involved, and they make the whole decision-making process extremely complicated. And it can create not only infighting within the family, but it creates total dysfunction within the organization. So the next typical issue that we see is that the successors are not prepared to lead. Recent example that we had was a young brother and sister combination were suddenly thrust into leadership positions because the father passed away unexpectedly. And there was never any situation where the father was deliberately preparing or developing his kids to actually lead the company. Yet his will and all the documentation that he left behind was that the company was to be turned over to them to lead the company. And that was all the detail that he provided. So here's what we recommend. Make sure that early on, that first of all, that you have a successor that's committed to the future role. You don't want to pass the company on to somebody simply because they're your kid or your nephew or your brother. You got to make sure that they're committed to running that company. I was down in Cleveland a while ago with a client, and this particular client has a daughter that he wants to be his successor. Well, so we started going through the succession planning and prep process. And in discussion with his daughter, I proceeded to tell her about, okay, your dad wants you to be the future president of this company. That's going to require a lot of 50 and 60-hour weeks. It's going to require a lot of stress. It's going to require you probably making a lot of hard decisions relative to people and customers and everything else. And as I'm going through this discussion with her, I can tell that she's really uncomfortable. And I asked her, I said, look, are you committed to this role? Do you really want this role? And she looked at me and she said, Jim, at the end of the day, I really don't want the job. I'm a single mom. I have a teenager. I have a lot going on in my life. I don't think I can work even 40 hours a week. So I really don't want this job. If in this situation we would have forced the job upon her, it would have been a failure waiting to happen because she had too many other priorities in her life to deal with. Nor did she really have the desire for the job. The next thing is we've got to assess the skills, the knowledge, and the behaviors long before the transition. So we want to assess this person. Are they really if they want it, do they have the skills, knowledge, and the types of traits that we need in the next successful leader? The next thing is we need to capture and document institutional knowledge that the owner has so that we can transition that. We need to create a career path so that the individual, the successor, can work through different parts of the organization to learn about it. And then we need to create an overall development plan for that person so that by the time comes, they're going to be ready for it. Let's take just a short break to give you a chance to maybe write one or two questions that you might have at this point in time. So please do. And what we will do, we'll also take a 3-minute coffee break before we get into the next section, just so you know. We'll take that break. So if you need to grab a coffee or a water, you can do that. So the next thing is the successor is treated differently. This is a huge mistake, and it leads to that person not being respected. I was walking through a plant, and I used this photo in the presentation with this young guy with his feet up on the desk. I was walking through a plant. It was a distressed company, and there was a young man sitting by one of the machines, and that's the pose he was in. He had his feet up on the machine. He had his hands behind his head, and he was taking a little siesta. And Everybody else around him was working feverishly. And as I'm walking through the plant, it was my first tour of this facility. And I asked the individual I was with, I said, what's the story with this guy? And he goes, oh, that's the owner's son. And so I'm like, okay, that's great. We kept walking, and we got into the back of the plant, and then we walked around, and we started coming back, and we went past the quality office. And in the quality office, there was another situation where there was a guy in there smoking a cigarette, and this is just a few years ago, so A, that wasn't allowed, but B, he had his feet up on the desk, drinking coffee, reading the newspaper, and everybody in the QC office was working feverishly. And I went by, and I'm like, oh, who's this guy? Oh, that's the owner's brother-in-law. Okay, so kind of continued the tour and went back around again, and the son was still sleeping, and went around again, and the brother-in-law was still reading the paper and drinking coffee. I think by this time he had finished his cigarette. And so, what really happened here was these people were being treated differently. And when I started to talk to the employees and learn more about what was going on, they had zero respect for the head of QC and for the owner's son. And the owner wanted the son to be the future leader of the company. The downside to that is you're essentially undermining their ability to be future leaders if you treat them that way, because they're never going to be respected, and they're going to be fighting an uphill battle from day one. So the things that need to happen here are we can't show blatant favoritism. We need to make sure that the successor leads by example. And what does that mean? Well, you know what? They should be the people that are the first to arrive at work. They should be the last ones to leave. They should be the ones that are helping the employees when they need help and working hard. So it really results in what it looks like is the owner is actually holding them to a higher standard. The next item is lack of clear rules. With successors, you've got to have clear rules, especially for the successors. How are they going to behave? What are they going to do? What are they not going to be allowed to do to make sure that they're going to be in a position of success? So again, some of those rules are don't show blatant favoritism, don't allow non-performance. Favoritism can also look like you see this young man showing up at a meeting late. It just doesn't work. You can't have that sort of environment and have that person be successor. If they're not performing, they need to be moved out of the company. They need to be counseled, and if they can't perform at the level they need to perform, then they either need to be moved into a job that's appropriate for them where they can perform, or they need to be moved out of the organization. Things like work hours, expense reporting, unacceptable behaviors and acceptable behaviors, reasons for termination, decision-making, sick time. We were in a company in the Howell area, and it was incredible because we had a number of siblings running the company. It was incredibly dysfunctional. They no longer spoke to one another, by the way, because it was so dysfunctional, because there was not a clear leader. And what we saw was it was a race to see who could extract more benefits from the company. And they were taking crazy amounts of vacation time. The coup de grace was one of the siblings actually used his expense report to buy a new car. And the company was essentially being thrown out of the bank by its bank and was in financial distress. And when we got into the details of it, it was simply because the family members were sucking all the cash out of the business. And the owner who had turned the business over to his kids had not established ground rules for successful management for the company. The next item, address poisonous divides. If there are cultural issues within an organization, if there are people that can't get along, especially in the family, that needs to be addressed. First of all, don't hire the troublemakers or those that have relationship issues or those that love drama. Just simply don't do it. But if you have already done it and it's too late, you have to fix those issues quickly. You can't let them fester because it will rub off on all the other employees. If poisonous relationships exist and you cannot fix them, then one or both of those individuals need to exit the company, and they need to understand that if they can't address those issues and find a peaceful resolution, then they need to exit the company. There's nothing like forcing somebody to do that, to either address it, and if they can't, then they need to be out. So here's the current situation that we see from a broad standpoint when it comes to succession planning. We find a blank canvas. In most places, people are too busy in the day-to-day firefighting, especially in the HR space. It's become so difficult to recruit and hire and onboard people that you're just struggling to keep your head above water. So we find that oftentimes there's just really no formal succession plan. So what do? Let's talk about, I want to keep it simple, right? Because you don't want to just go in and start some process that's going to take 100% of your time over the next 6 months, because we know from experience that just won't happen and won't be successful. So what you really want to do is identify 1 to 2 ideal successors for every critical position. And there might be, 5 or 6 of those positions that you deem as critical. If in critical is somebody that, hey, there's a key person that's going to retire soon, or it's somebody that maybe is your key engineer that if this person leaves, we're going to have real issues with customer support or quoting or whatever it might be. Then you need to prioritize the areas of concern. So if you've got 7 or 8 critical areas, make sure you prioritize them, and then build a plan to build the successors for those high-risk areas. So identify all the 1 to 2 successors for critical positions, prioritize them, and build a plan to develop them so that you have a successor that will actually be ready to take over and succeed in that role on a going forward basis. So with that, we're going to shift gears completely. We're going to talk about the half-day talent planning session. During this time, let's take 3 minutes. Please use the restroom, grab a coffee or a water, and we will resume in about 3, let's make it 4 minutes. We will resume and we'll talk about the opportunity that the MEDC has afforded you with the half-day talent planning sessions. Thank you. All right, everybody, I hope you had a chance to grab some water or coffee or use the restroom. Let's talk about the opportunity that we've been talking about, the half-day talent planning sessions. We really talk about it as a roadmap. The difficulty that most of us have is we're embedded in this war for talent, and oftentimes we don't have a cohesive, all-encompassing strategy to make sure that we're going to win, to make sure that we are going to attract the talent we need, retain the talent we need, and to develop the types of skills and knowledge and capabilities that we need in our organization. And what we like to do is go through a half-day session with companies to help them build that roadmap, to figure out where do they stand on some key metrics relative to other companies, and where are they underperforming, where are they doing okay, and where are they doing great. And then we'd like to talk through what are best practices that other companies are doing in each of these metrics. And when I talk about metrics, I'm talking about things related to attraction, development, retention, talent strategy, and talent management. And we like to then work on creating, what are those best practices that would best apply to your organization? And then how do we apply them in a way that you can implement them in a priority order to really create an environment where you're going to start to win the war for talent. So we start by having the organizations that participate, they take a survey. And our preference is that all the leaders and as many employees as you can get to take the survey, take it. It takes about 7 or 8 minutes to complete. It's super easy. There are 31 questions, and we'll get results that look like this, where you can see different questions, and you can see red, yellow, or green scores from the company. And it allows us to walk through each of the questions, how you scored, and then we can work with you on understanding, what are those things that you as a company can begin to do that will allow you to really start to succeed in the war for talent. You'll also get, you'll get full copy of the results in the half-day talent planning session. And the cool thing is, if you look at the screen that I'm showing you, there's the EDSI talent pentachart on the left-hand side. That blue diagram that you see, those blue scores are from your company. The gray are from all the other 700 and some plus companies that have taken this survey. So you're actually going to get the chance to compare yourself to hundreds of companies that have taken the survey to see really how are you doing. We'll also ask the employees, on the top left you see a morale score on a 10 scale. We also ask them what we call the employee net promoter score. Would you recommend working at this company or working for this company to friends or family? And we'll create a score there and give you an employee net promoter score. What you'll find is there's some really valuable information, in the survey. We'll walk you through it. We'll make sure that you have a very specific plan of action to use on a going forward basis so that you can succeed in the war for talent. The cool thing is here, we typically charge $1,250 for companies, $1,500 for companies to do this. But the MEDC is covering $1,250 of that. So the remaining $250 is not going to us. The remaining $250 that companies are paying is going back to the local economic development groups to fund this for more companies. So, we've already been paid by the MEDC. So our goal is just to simply support them and support you guys by helping you create talent strategies that are going to win. And look, many of you may be in rural areas, which can make it very, very difficult. In a lot of rural areas, we hear folks say, we just simply can't find the bodies, right? Or we have a lot of young people that want to move away. And we have a lot of strategies that we can help you develop and work on to make sure you succeed. And the same goes to just suburban and urban areas. They all have their own complexities. So this is a great opportunity. I think the critical thing is if you're interested in this, Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong, we have one more opening?
Correct.
We're going to try to get 2 or 3 more openings based on the funding that has come in from the other companies. So please, if you're interested in this, either call or email me or call or email Kevin Watson, and we'll make sure that you get included in the list of companies participating. And Kevin will reach back out to you in terms of logistics and everything else. Again, it's a 4-hour process. We try to get key leaders around the table. Ideally, the CEO or owner or head person in your location joins, because we want to make sure that they hear what's going on and that they're involved in it, because we're going to have more buy-in to helping you implement whatever changes you need to implement on a going forward basis. You can see my name, my phone number, my email up there. So please write that down. And also in the email, if you want a copy of this presentation, please send me an email asking for a copy of the presentation, and I will send the whole thing to you. Okay? If there are questions, please submit them right now. Kevin's manning the computer. All right. Now we're going to talk about the last section, knowledge capture and transfer. This is the area that most companies really don't do a great job Even really large companies with tremendous amounts of human resource talent and capability, they don't do a great job of this. So it's something that I think probably gets underplayed most of the time, and it's as important to the succession planning process as anything else. When we talk about knowledge capture and transfer, we think about it either as specific individuals or to groups of individuals. And so we'll kind of talk about that. But the first thing, I want to kind of go back into some of the typical mistakes again. We usually see companies just ignoring it. Oh, Bob is 70 years old, and but he's really healthy and he loves coming to work and doesn't talk about retiring on any given day. Well, that's really ignoring the problem. The thing that we need to do is just make sure that, look, we have some older workers. We have to admit that we have an issue. We have to figure out really what's at stake if we don't take action. Because at the end of the day, if we really begin to think about what's at stake if those people leave, it suddenly becomes a lot more important to us. So what I want you to do is just take the next 60 seconds and write down the following. If we don't implement a knowledge retention and transfer initiative, what is going to be adversely impacted as a result? Think about some of the people in your organization. Imagine 3 or 4 of the critical people in your organization. If they were gone tomorrow, what would be inversely impacted in your organization? Would it be sales? Would it be customer relationships? Would it be technical capability, etc.? So take a few minutes and write that down. All right. Now, the second typical mistake that we see is when we're talking to our clients, they always seem to think that somebody else is solving that problem. Oh, the department manager for engineering is doing that. Oh, the sales manager is doing that. Oh, manufacturing manager is doing that. Everybody seems to think somebody else is doing it, and what we generally find is everybody thinks somebody else is doing it, but nobody's really doing it. So somebody's got to really kind of take the bull by the horns, and that's generally the people that are on this call, and that is put a plan in place, establish some goals, put it in writing if that works for you. But and probably as important as anything else, get some leadership buy-in. It's easy. A business owner or a local president will really understand the fact that, hey, if this person goes away tomorrow, it's going to impact the business by this. And that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars. It could be the difference between success and failure of an organization in some cases. So get buy-in that it needs to become a priority and that we need to put some resources behind it. And the next typical mistake, not getting the leadership buy-in. If they don't understand why this, because it sounds a little academic, right? What do you mean by knowledge capture and transfer? Not getting buy-in is critical because at the end of the day, you are going to need time, energy, resource, and it's going to have to become a priority to make it happen. So we always say, get everybody around the table and talk about it and really talk about the ROI.
So that's another intended outcome from our perspective, is just to make sure that you guys have a voice, you have a seat at the table, and that will help make sure that there's a cohesive plan going forward.
Kemp, thank you for that. That's such a great point, right? Because we tell people all the time that when you really understand the war for talent and what's going to happen over the next 10 years, the HR leader in companies is as important as any other person in that organization right now. In fact, they might be truly the most important person strategically to most organizations on a going forward basis. So we like to make sure that you guys get elevated to always being involved in the critical decisions because of the criticality of your role. Typical mistake number 4. People throw spaghetti at the wall, right? They say, "Oh, I'm doing a little bit of it here. We're doing that here," and it's a patchwork of activity. It can't be. You got to get a process in place that really focuses from beginning to end on this thing. Even if you just do one person at a time, and we're going to talk about how you can do that. but you got to make sure that it's a process that you follow. So, we just think that when people follow a process, they learn from it, they repeat it, and they get a nice, usable outcome. The last thing that I want to talk about is, please don't try to do too much at the same time when you're doing this. I'll talk more about what this is, right? But you guys are all so busy. We typically see stressed out HR leaders, HR professionals. They're stressed, they're frustrated, and they're spending a lot of time doing maybe not necessarily the things that brought them to HR in the first place. And by that, I mean, you're spending a lot of time doing exit interviews, recruiting and hiring and onboarding, rinse, repeat, right? So trying to do too much at one time is going to be difficult, and balls will start to get dropped. So it's the old adage, how do you eat an elephant? Do it one bite at a time. And with knowledge capture and transfer, figure out your priorities, and if you have to, just do one person at a time, one department at a time, or make sure that you match it to the resources that you have.
Yeah, just one additional thing to add on that front. Oftentimes we'll go into an organization and they're throwing spaghetti at the wall. They're trying 5 or 6 different initiatives concurrently with little to no success, and they're struggling to understand why it's not working. I'll give you a real life example. We were working with a company in mid-Michigan recently, and we sat down, we did some one-on-one interviews with everybody from the CEO down to person pushing a broom in the manufacturing shop floor. And what we heard and what we found is that it was simple little things. There was an us versus them divide. The leadership team came in and they parked on a paved lot, and the rest of the employees are blowing out tires in a parking lot that looked like it was bombed out. The leadership team had a nice air-conditioned office and a break room, and the rest of the employees didn't. In one company it was inadequate lighting and people were getting hurt on the job. In another company they didn't have enough oscillating fans, so people were literally walking off the job, going and grabbing fans and almost getting in fistfights, trying to navigate through that. For another company it was, they wanted new chairs because people's backs were hurting because they had old, outdated chairs that weren't ergonomic. So, oftentimes it's simple little things. Think about what you're doing from an us versus them divide standpoint. Think about, is this the type of environment that you would want your mom or your dad or your son or your daughter to work in? And make little fixes on that front. Sometimes those can have a dramatic impact as well.
Thank you, Cal. So where do you start, right? First of all, keep it simple. The KISS principle is always a good one to follow. And let's really talk about, you start with who. Who can't your organization live without, right? If this person goes away, and I think we had you write down before some people that you might be concerned about, who can't you live without? Who's going to have a negative impact? Start there and prioritize it. Now, if they're older workers, there's a way to do it. There's a methodology that was developed by the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is the water authority in the Tennessee Valley region. They had a significant issue with an aging workforce, and they came up with this methodology. And the first piece of it is figure out what the retirement factor was. And the retirement factor, they scored on a 1 to 5, and they said 5 is projected retirement date is within the current or next fiscal year. And then you can see all the way down to a 1, it's greater than the 6th fiscal year. So the closer they are to retirement and projected retirement, the higher the score. And then there's a position risk factor that they added, and that is a 5 to 1 scoring. And it's really an estimate of the difficulty of how difficult will it be to replace this position or this person. And so if it takes 3 to 5 years of training and experience, they got a 5. And you can see down to 1, it requires little additional training. So what the Tennessee Valley Authority did was they took those, they have a very large workforce, and they were aging, and they gave everybody a score. And then what they did is they came up with a total attrition factor. So that was an estimate of the effort and urgency necessary to effectively manage the attrition. And again, you can see there's just buckets for scoring, and their model was anybody that was in the 20 to 25 was considered high priority. Now, for you guys, what I recommend is you go through this, especially if you got an aging workforce. This is a great way to do it, and then you force rank people. You might have one person that's a 20, you might have one that's an 18, you might have one that's a 16. Force rank them and start with your 20, and then move to the 18, and then move to the 16. Now, there may be other high, and there almost always are, high-risk workers that may not be 60 years old. They might be somebody that's 40 years old, but you know what? If this person left, it would have a dramatic impact on your business. In this case, you know, things that you need to think about is if this person left, would we lose customers? Usually they're salespeople, where you think about, you know, Jennifer is 38 years old. She's awesome. She's developed tremendous relationships. She's our best salesperson. What would happen if she left? It would be difficult to train a replacement. Somebody might have a particular set of skills that are so difficult for somebody to have an uptake process for that it would be very difficult. And there isn't maybe anybody that shares a lot of common skills. So difficult to train is something we should be thinking about. It would be impossible or nearly impossible to find a replacement. We call it unicorn hunting. I bet each and every one of you have either are or have been unicorn hunting sometime in the last couple of years. And that is you're looking for somebody that just simply doesn't exist out there. If they do exist, they're already employed by another company and they're coveted and they're probably highly paid. We would lose critical skills or capabilities. Is there somebody in your organization that has the ability, maybe it's a skilled tradesperson or a capability that they have to do something that nobody else has? And then the last one is critical knowledge, institutional knowledge. Who is it that knows how to fix all the old machines in your plant? Or, you know, this is a classic example, right? We went out to this company, and this is an aluminum recycling facility. And they use a lot of electricity. It's a big plant. And when we were talking to them, we realized they only had one electrician. The electrician was in his 60s. And this particular person fixed all of their major equipment. He was the guy that knew how to fix everything. And he was working like 60 hours a week. He was in his 60s, and they were really concerned if something happened to him, right? So if you have anybody like that that has that critical knowledge, they absolutely need to be part of this process. I want you to take the next 60 seconds and write down the following. If the following individuals announced they were leaving the organization tomorrow, it would significantly impact productivity, profitability, morale, etc. Go ahead and just write down one or more names in your organization, or it might be a position. All right, we talked about who. Let's talk about what. What needs to happen? So once you've identified the individuals, right, you kind of know the positions and the people that are critical in terms of succession and knowledge capture. You know, you say, Jim, you keep talking about knowledge capture, but you haven't told us how to do it. Well, let's talk about it. Step one is really creating a job task analysis. And we like to do it, you know, we have our own software called SkillDex that we've been using, that we've built and used for the last 25 years. And it's really based on this principle. You sit down and you interview a subject matter expert or an individual that you're concerned about from an aging out perspective or criticality of the role perspective, and you really document what are all of their responsibilities. And it can take, you know, these interviews can take a half hour and they can take 2 hours, but talk through each of the responsibilities that they have. And then for every responsibility they have, what are those key tasks that they need to do? Let's say I'm the only mechanic that you have in your shop. And let's say, one of my responsibilities is to do tune-ups on cars, right? That would be a responsibility. The tasks would be simple things like remove spark plugs, gap the new spark plugs, insert the new spark plugs. Those would be the types of things that would be considered tasks. And then have them score them on a scale of 0 to 4. What level of competence or benchmark skill level do I need to have to do this job? So in our benchmarking scores are 0 to 4. 0 is not aware of this task, up to like 3, which is able to perform the task without any assistance. And 4 is I'm able to instruct others in the task. I can teach it. I can instruct others, which means I know it so well, I can teach you how to do it. So create that job task analysis where you got the responsibilities, you've got the tasks, and then you have the benchmark rating of how capable do you need to be in this job for doing each of those tasks. Oh, by the way, when you do this, this is a great tool to then go back to your job descriptions and say, are my job descriptions actually accurate? Maybe they're incomplete. You can add the job task analysis directly to your job descriptions. It's a great addition to your job descriptions. Kev?
Yeah, one of the things we often see when you go through this process, especially somebody that may be getting up there in years, is they started doing fill-in-the-blank position 30 years ago, and then somebody else left and they kind of absorbed some of their responsibilities and their position morphed. And then somebody else left and the position morphed a little bit more. So oftentimes you go through this process and you say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize Jim did all of these things. He probably shouldn't have been doing all of these things. And we're not going to find somebody, nor should we, that is a one-to-one replacement for Jim. So oftentimes what we see throughout this process is you look at it and say, gosh, whoever is going to backfill Jim's position should focus on these responsibilities and tasks. We need to move these tasks over to this individual because they're uniquely suited to do that. They're energized by that. You may identify some responsibilities and tasks that just disappear. Gosh, I can't believe we're still doing that. Technology has made that obsolete or unnecessary. So through this process, it is oftentimes helpful to eliminate tasks, to move tasks around to people that are more uniquely suited or energized by the type of work. And oftentimes it's not truly a Jim's leaving, we're going to hire somebody else and they're going to be Jim Jr. Oftentimes it's a new hybrid type of role that exists. So helpful process, even if you're not concerned about people retiring, you may just want to make this a best practice to go through on a rolling basis with some key positions to make sure that people are doing what they should be doing.
Great point, Kev. We recently had a client where their CFO left unexpectedly. And what we found out was when we went through this process with him, because we were able to do this with him before he departed, he did give a proper 2-week notice. And after he left and we divided up his work to other people, we realized, A, we didn't need to backfill his position, so it saved the company a bunch of money. But more importantly, he was doing a lot of stuff that didn't need to be done anymore. He was creating a lot of reports that nobody used, doing a lot of analysis that nobody ever looked at. And so we realized that a lot of the work could just go away, and actually the position went away as well. So do the job task analysis. The second thing, and this goes hand in glove with the job task analysis, conduct what in the industry we call a knowledge loss risk assessment interview. Essentially, you're interviewing the person to try to capture and document critical job and institutional knowledge. Let me give you some examples. You have to create your own questions based on the position, but questions can be things like this. What are the most critical skills you have? And document that. What responsibilities do you have that cannot be currently handled by someone else? So you can see, oh my gosh, we have gaps. Are there credentials required for this job? If so, what are they? Was there education required for this job? How did you develop the skills that you have? I love some of these questions. What's the biggest mistake you ever made when? For example, when designing this product or when selling to a customer. What's the biggest customer you ever lost and why? You know, a lot of people, we can learn from their mistakes as well as their successes. So these questions can be really, really valuable. You know, examples, again, maybe it's a maintenance person. Hey, this machine is critical. You're the only one that knows how to fix it. And it always seems that there's a problem with the pump. Where do you get the pumps? Do we have them in stock? Do we keep an extra? Or is there a vendor that you go to? If so, who is that vendor that you go to get those? Those types of questions and that type of knowledge can save your organization a huge amount of money, time, and embarrassment if you understand that stuff before something bad happens. So when you do the interview, you create notes, right? You've already done a job task analysis, and then you create the KLRA interview notes, and you have really two really base documents that you can use. Here are the two things that we suggest that you do in addition to having that information. We love to create videos. We have a professional videographer that we'll take to our clients when we're doing this, and he will film us interviewing the subject matter expert, and we'll ask critical questions and film it, and then we'll put it onto YouTube on private YouTube sites so that only your employees, or maybe only those that you designate, can see those interviews and learn from them. The beautiful thing is, look, if you want them super professional, you can hire people like us to help you, but you can also do this with your cell phone, right? You can literally have somebody in there with an iPhone or with an Android phone filming it, and you can upload them to YouTube. So tremendous way for people to learn. Most people would much rather sit and listen to somebody talk about stories and see the video versus maybe just reading notes. And then case studies. Build some case studies. If a successor is going to go into a job, make sure that they have 5 or 6 case studies of here are the biggest problems that you're going to face, right? And here's how they've been handled in the past. Here's the successes that we've had handling it. Here are the failures we've had. And here's what we did to fix it. You know, with HR, if somebody's leaving from HR, you know, what's the best hire you ever made and why? What's the worst hire you ever made and why? And what did we learn from it? Questions like that can be extremely valuable.
Yeah, one other thing, and if you know, oftentimes people pose this question as we're presenting on this topic is, you know, gosh, well, I have, you know, Susan, and Susan's been here a really long time, and you know, she might not want to share this information because it's job security for Susan, or, you know, they wrap their arms pretty tightly around it. What we found is that if you tee this up the right way, you know, people are typically really honored by this, right? So if you say, gosh, we hope you don't leave, we hope you never leave, and we know that you're not going to be here forever. You can stay as long as you want, right? We're not trying to push you out. And we think so highly of you and the work that you do that we would be absolutely devastated if something happened and you left unexpectedly and we didn't have, you know, weren't able to capture that institutional knowledge. What we found is that, you know, oftentimes the people that companies think will wrap their arms super tightly around this are so honored, and they often break down crying when we're doing these interviews because they want to feel like the last 20, 30 years have been worth it, right? They want to have a legacy. They want that knowledge to carry on. You know, oftentimes we talk to people that left, and now the company's scrambling and they want to bring them back on a consulting basis and pay them 4 times as much money as they were paying them. Sometimes the people say, you know what, if they didn't value me enough to go through this process before I left, shame on them, I'm not coming back. So, you know, I think the important piece here is just being proactive. We see it all the time where companies try and do this reactively, and oftentimes it's too late and that institutional knowledge is gone forever.
Kev, that's a really good point. I recently had a discussion with a friend, and it was a lady who is 60 years old, and she just took the buyout from Ford Motor Company. And I won't go into too much detail about her job, but I asked her, we were sitting down, it was a Friday night, we were having dinner with this couple, and I asked her, I said, Linda, tell me about, what it's like. I mean, how did it feel to go through the process? And how is retirement treating you so far? And she goes, Jim, it's great. It's an adjustment. But she goes, there's one thing that really bothers me right now. And it is, when I left, I was told, right, we had like this 2-week window where we could take the buyout. I had to go through decisions about taking it or not. She decides to take it. She goes, they never sat down with me. And nobody ever came to me and said, Linda, what do you do? And how are we going to do this when you're gone? Nobody ever really tried to capture her knowledge and behaviors or anything else. And she just kind of felt like everything that she had done for years was just going to get lost. And it was an awful feeling for her. And she actually had a lot of remorse because Ford at the time did not do this. So it is a really interesting dynamic. And as you pointed out, Kev, people want to feel like they're leaving a legacy and that they're doing something that's going to continue on. So we've talked about succession planning, identifying those critical positions, maybe capturing some of the knowledge. But then what about who the successors are? Here's some simple steps that we suggest. One, who did the interviewee select? Usually they know 1 or 2 people that would be good successors. And oftentimes they have a better feel than a lot of other people in the organization. Kev, you might want to talk about the one that we just went through where this happened.
Yeah, so we went through this process with a client. The gentleman had been there 38 years, was diagnosed with stage 4 terminal cancer. We went through this process. We got some absolute gold from the interview process, from the video documentation. We were able to really allow his legacy to live on. Additionally, as we were going through this, we said, who would you recommend? You've got 3 or 4 names that the leadership team has been floating around as potential successors. This name keeps bubbling up to the top. Is that who you would pick? He said, absolutely not. That's who everyone thinks I would pick, and that's who everyone thinks probably will be the next person in line. It's the absolute wrong decision. Technical skills all day. They have the technical skills without a doubt. They don't have the people skills. They will not be a great leader of people, and that's what this role needs. And they will fall flat on their face, right? And he said, are they going to be upset? Absolutely. Will they leave? Maybe. Would that be the worst thing? Not necessarily. He said, if we promote this person, that would be worse than if this person left. It cannot be this person. So, oftentimes they have a really good sense or a feel for who that person should be. We see it all the time. You have a great salesperson, so they get promoted to a sales manager and they fall flat. You have a great machine operator and they get promoted to, a supervisor or plant manager and they fall flat, right? So, the technical skills don't always translate to the leadership skills. So I think that is equally, if not more important, as you're thinking through the succession process.
Thank you, Kev. The next step is, who did they select? Are there 2 or 3 people? But then ask them, are they interested? Because at the end of the day, if somebody's not interested in the role, don't waste your time with it. They've got to be interested. They've got to have some fire in the belly to do that job. Otherwise, they're probably not going to do all that well in it. Then look at their past performance. So, hey, has the person shown a history of being a performer? Have they shown some of the skills and behaviors that we need in that job? So take a look at that. Then assess their capabilities. So we now know we have a profile for what that job is, right? We kind of know, we've done a JTA, we know a lot of the knowledge, we know some of the behaviors, et cetera. And oh, by the way, and I think I failed to mention this, and this is my fault, when you do the KLRA interview, you should also ask, like, what are behaviors that are successful in this role? What are behaviors that are going to hurt you in this role, right? Because a lot of times people have learned things that you got to do and things that you can't do, right? So assess this individual on their capabilities, their skills, their knowledge, their behaviors. Then, whoops, hit the wrong one. Then identify the gaps and intangibles and other variables. So what are the things that they need to have? What are their skill gaps? And once you've done that, create a development plan for them. Kind of goes back to the first thing that I talked about in the succession planning for a leader, and that is make sure that the junior is ready to take over. Build a development plan for that person. The Peter Principle we've all heard of, right? There's a lot of people that may be in an organization and they've been successful and they've been promoted maybe multiple times. And all of a sudden they hit a job where they're not doing very well. And oftentimes they fail at that job. And we always call that the Peter Principle. Well, they rose as high as they could get. Well, the reality is jobs change. As you get higher in an organization or you take on different jobs, just because you're a great engineer doesn't mean you're going to be a great engineering manager. So you need to recognize there are differences in each job, and you need to prepare that person. Because most of the time, if we pick the right person and we give them the right development plan, they're going to do just fine. Now there may be some, first you gotta work with the right raw material, right? But that plan is as important as anything else you can do. So creating the training plan, we call it a development plan. You must do that. When are you going to start with this stuff? Well, none of us have a time machine, so you can't go back in the past and do it. If you've already been doing this, kudos to you. Our advice is start now. Because we all know what's going on with baby boomers. We all know what's going on with the talent war. If we don't start this stuff now, it's going to come back and bite you, and it's going to make things a lot worse if you don't. I want to talk for just a few minutes about what if you have, because what we've told you really is applied, for example, to maybe an individual, right, in terms of knowledge capture. And what if you have a large manufacturing plant or a service business or what have you, and you have many people all within one job category? How do you deal with that? How do you identify who you need to address? Well, here's an example of something that we did with a very large client in Chicago. And we have a software, again, called SkillDex that we use to do this. You can do this in Excel if you want to. It's a little more complex to do in Excel, but you take your job task analysis that you've already created, and then you build it into a spreadsheet, and then you begin to test everybody in that job. And you have them give a score, do a self-assessment, and you tell them that, look, all we're trying to do is understand, we're trying to build a training plan, we're trying to figure out who needs what training. So please just honestly assess yourself on each one of these responsibilities and tasks and give us your score from a 0 all the way to a 4, right? And typically, like the example that you see here is on that second task. The responsibility here is applying math skills to CNC operations. The second task is calculate machine speeds and feeds by formula. And you can see that this person rated themselves a 2, so that gives them a red score because that's lower than the benchmark score. You can quickly see all the green and red scores, and you can quickly see who needs what training. So if we look at a department, if everybody does this, over on the left you can see responsibilities and tasks. You can see employees across the top, and you can see red, yellow, and green scoring. Now in this particular case, we've scored red as being their zeros, because they don't even know what it is. Yellows they're below the particular benchmark score, and green means they're at or above the benchmark score.
So you can see, you know, who has what gaps, and you can develop training plans based on that. But more importantly, if you have an aging workforce, you can estimate when people are going to retire, and then you can age this thing out. And you can see at the top, after 3 years, we've blacked out who we think is going to retire, and all of their scores become red. And by year 5, and this is real data from a client, and you can see all of these individuals that within 5 years they expected to be gone. And what's scary here is when you look down at the grind machine responsibility, which is that third one down, there's only one person in that whole organization that can run the grind machine at the levels required. So it certainly allows you to assess priorities in terms of training and hiring, etc. Kev?
Yeah, just one additional point to make. I know a lot of these examples are in the manufacturing space, just because of the geographic location that we're in, but we have done this across white collar, blue collar, all different types of industries. I know we have some folks from the medical field, some folks from construction, etc. So, you know, this is absolutely applicable across industries, across departments, divisions. You know, we did this internally for our own finance team as somebody was going on maternity leave. So, you know, I just wanted to stress that point that while a lot of these are manufacturing examples, absolutely applicable across industries.
So just a couple more minutes here and we're going to wrap up. You know, bridging the skills gap, if you've got somebody where you do need to bridge the skills gap, things to be thinking about, right? Do you have updated training materials? And that can be videos, that can be documentation. Do you have KLRA interview notes for individuals that when they go away, other individuals can read them? Have you built case studies? Do you have journals? Videos and webinars, put them together and use them. They're a great tool for teaching and heavily underutilized in today's world, especially given the fact that they can be so inexpensive to do now. The last thing I want to mention here is don't forget to use structured mentoring and training. Especially if you've got a younger person coming in that's going to take over a role at some point, make sure that the subject matter expert or the person that may be leaving, make sure that they are assigned a mentoring role with that person so that they can really work with them and give them a little bit of training on how to be a mentor ahead of time, okay? But mentoring can be a wonderful thing. Two last things I want to mention. There are a lot of resources out there. Michigan, you know, for all of the issues that we have, if you go over to Michigan Works, for example, they have a lot of on-the-job training dollars available to you, which in some cases, so if you hire somebody and you're going to do new training or training for this person, you can get up to 80% of their wages paid for like up to 20 weeks, which is incredible. Now it says 50% here. That is technically what they will tell you. We've seen it as high as 80%. So there's a lot of dollars out there for training and development of your people. And there's other incentives that exist out there. Our advice to you is to talk to your business service professional at Michigan Works. They know about all this stuff. They can help you navigate through that situation. So the last thing I want to have you do is just spend just a few seconds here to write down the following. When you get back from this event, now typically we're delivering this live, so you're doing it webinar. So when this is over, what are you going to do? Am I going to schedule a meeting with the following individuals to discuss succession planning or knowledge retention? Advice here is schedule a meeting, right? Figure out who do you need to get in this meeting and talk about putting together a plan so that you succeed, okay? From our perspective, you can call us. We can help you with this process. Happy to do it. But certainly, it's a process that you need to follow. Whether you engage professionals like us to help you, that's great. We're happy to help. But if you don't, at least just get the process going. And the last note for me is don't forget about the half-day talent planning session. If you are interested, it's extremely valuable and helpful, and it really allows you to get really focused on what you need to do to succeed in the war for talent. Send me an email, jbitterle, jbitterle @edsisolutions.com. You can go to our website, edsisolutions.com, if you want to find my contact details or Kevin Watson's details to contact us. So with that, we're done. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in right now, and we'll answer them via phone. If there's anybody, if you need to leave, that's great. But if anybody has any follow-up questions, please type them on in right now, and Kevin and I will stay here as long as you need us here to help you answer some questions. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll give it a minute here for any questions. All right, I don't see any questions coming in. If you are typing and it's just not seeing it pop up yet, please feel free to shoot that over to Jim directly or myself at kwatson@EDSI Solutions. And to Jim's point, if you're interested in participating in securing that final spot for the half-day talent planning sessions, please let us know as soon as possible on that front as well. All right, thank you, everyone.